afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon.
Okay, I'm glad that everyone, we had something to eat. I'm sure we're all excited for the next discussion, right?
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes.
Okay, Molele. Okay, so welcome to panel 2, Africa's Aviation Future, Connectivity, Competitiveness, and Growth. Aviation is a lifeline for Africa's economic integration, tourism, and trade. Yet today, the continent faces the fragmented markets, high costs, and connectivity gaps that limit growth. Unlocking aviation potential could transform not only how Africans travel, but how Africa competes globally. We are honored to be joined by Ogaga Udjo, principal at Logix Advisory. Ogaga has held senior roles at Comair, South African Airways, and Qatar Airways, where he led network planning, strategy, and alliances. He's one of Africa's leading aviation strategists, regularly featured in international media on the future of aviation. Yeah.
Afternoon, everyone.
Hello. Turning on?
Testing.
Okay, so before we start, maybe just briefly introduce yourself and then we'll go straight into it.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. As for the opening, my name is Ogaga Udjo. I'm really excited to be here. I feel like why I love aviation is a community aspect, and I think that's definitely part of it. So my background, I'm South African Nigerian. Let me start there. I've always been in the aviation industry. I did not go to an airport one day and get inspired, I'll be honest. But I do believe in a borderless life, and I believe in the beauty of human connection. And I think that is what drew me to the aviation industry. So as per the introduction, I've worked in several airlines. And then from there, I really moved into the private advisory space, not just dealing with the aviation sector or the airline sector per se, but across airports, investors, particularly infrastructure investors, the technology providers, the OEMs, your Boeings, your Airbus, etc. So I've been in the aviation industry for about 15 years and have worked across different parts of the value chain. But I definitely thank my network planning background for my kind of input into the industry. And what I do now, I have multiple capacities. I also work with the World Bank in an advisory capacity as well, where I really focus on route development and regional connectivity for a range of client governments. And in my private practice, I deal with 3 pillars: air services development, which is route development; corporate advisory, as we know it, particularly on the financial investment side, as well as air political affairs. And I think our discussion today will talk to just the role of regulators, governments, and how that is different across the African market and what that means for the US-Africa collaboration.
Absolutely, that was wonderful. So we're going to go into the first segment, the state of African aviation. So here's the first question. From your perspective, what is the current state of Africa's aviation industry, and why does connectivity remain such a persistent challenge?
As I said, when we were chatting before, and if you see my previous interviews on CNBC or wherever, I always start by saying Africa is not a monolith. And I think that in this room, we are, the community that understands that really well. So the state of African aviation, it really depends on how one looks at it, but I'll start with a few headlines. So aviation in general is not a profitable industry, right? We have very thin margins globally. That has always been the case for decades, around 3%. Just last year, our return on invested capital as a global sector was around 6%. And there's expectations for around 6.7 this year. So aviation is not a profitable business. It is a thin margin business, but it is one of our scale. African aviation has struggled in terms of the net bottom line around profitability, but in the last 2 years in particular, so post the COVID recovery, there's been an evening out at that bottom line. So last year, the industry in Africa made 200 million profit, which was a huge change compared to the last 10 years. That was about a 1% margin, and this year, although the absolute value amount is expected to be the same, it's a slightly improved increment of 1.1% in profit margin. So in that space, from a profitability perspective, I think there's a lot of things that one needs to do. But giving a little picture of African aviation, I like to start kind of geographically. So you see a lot of dynamics at a regional level. So starting where I'm from, Southern Africa is the largest market segment of African aviation, and differently to other parts of the continent, there is a very large and mature, for the most part, connectivity around domestic and regional connectivity. What is pervasive across the continent, although not exactly the same, is that governments are quite exposed as investors, meaning that governments either have minority stakes, majority stakes in airlines, and in addition in other parts of the value chain, so across airports, some ground handling companies, etc. Whereas, for example, in the US, you find that these are more public-private partnerships, particularly on the airport side, and there's no real government ownership in the airlines, but I could argue about what that looks like in Chapter 11. But anyway, so kind of given that picture, African aviation really has a lot of governments involved as investors, and different types of investments, different structures across the market. And geographically speaking, East Africa is of course quite concentrated. In that catchment area, you not only have the majors such as Kenya Airways, Ethiopian Airways, or Ethiopian Airlines rather, but you also have Rwanda Air, which is highly ambitious, is doing quite a bit, has gotten into several agreements with the Qatari government at both the airport and the airline level. And West Central Africa, what is interesting is that there isn't a pervasive national carrier, and I focus on my other market, Nigeria. Nigeria does not have a national airline. It has a huge potential for a domestic market that is highly underserved. But if you look at the airline APs has driven market growth and market support significantly over the last 5, 6, 7 years. So there are a lot of different dynamics, but I would say that what represents Africa in many ways is that there's different levels of urbanization. We have fragmented markets. We have high cost barriers, both at a macro level and a micro country level. And then we have a lot of government ownership and exposure across those markets. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And just maybe one point for just kind of setting that scene is that, Africa, we have about 80% of the world's global population, but less than 3% of airline market share. So just to give some context in terms of how much more we can do, and how much more aviation can support our continental goals.
Absolutely. I love that response that you gave. Even though you did touch a little bit on this, I want you to elaborate more on how Africa's aviation sector compares with other emerging markets in terms of competitiveness, infrastructure, and policy environment.
Sure. So competitive infrastructure and policy. I think it's, firstly I'm going to say which markets are we comparing to, but I'll make more emerging market distinctions. So if I could at a high level compare African aviation to another, just superficially, regionally, I'll probably say Latin America and the Caribbean. And I do quite a bit of work with CARICOM countries, but I'm particularly focused on the Eastern Caribbean. And there's a lot of similarities. Also, Africa has a few small island developing states, island nations. So I think that dynamic is quite interesting. The role of what we call critical air infrastructure, essential air services, that role becomes even more highlighted in markets like Mauritius, Sao Tome, Cabo Verde, even Botswana, which is not a SID, but based on the demographics, essential air service is quite important. So I'd say comparatively, Latin America and South, probably South Asia, simply because there's a lot of regional connectivity. A lot of the structural dynamics are quite similar. And there has been the past presence of national carriers, right? But talking on competitiveness, I think that it's important to note how are people moving right now. And about 60% of African aviation is moved by not up to 15 airlines. They move by about 10. And if we remove the non-African airlines, including Turkish, Emirates, Qatar, who are really quite involved in the sector, United and Delta increasingly more so, you have airlines that are former, pseudo, or part state-owned carriers, right? What we call flag carriers. So yes, they're not all 100% government-owned like Ethiopian Airlines would be, but they are, in some shape or form have come from that. So from, a Royal Emirates, Egypt Air, Rwanda Air, Kenya Airways, South African Airways, although it's a lot smaller than it was just 3 years ago. The flag carriers carry quite a bit of that traffic, and I do think that has been interesting. It's been the driver of the development and industrialization of the sector over many years, but I don't think it's necessarily been the most competitive in many ways. And cut to, if you look at who are the real kind of innovators and the growers, you have airlines such as FlySafair. Although FlySafair operate in South Africa, I believe they're the only actual low-cost carrier in the whole of the continent. We do not have low-cost models. We might have low-fare models, we don't have low-cost models. They are actually one of the continent's largest airlines, although they operate mostly in South Africa, like maybe 2 or 3 other countries. Airlink has also been quite an important one. Airlink was a private airline, but then it was around 1993, 1994, it got into a franchise agreement with the South African government. Airlink has become a significant regional player. Qatar was just invested in them. They've taken a minority equity ownership in them in the last year. That is an important airline in terms of connecting the continent. So I'm saying all of this to say that I think that it has been an interesting dynamic between public and private airlines. I think that both have been critical to the development of African aviation. And I do think that competitiveness is different. That's probably our biggest asset and also largest liability, that there isn't consistency in networks, in scalability, in governance, in all of the elements for this aviation product from an African perspective, and it is fiercely competitive. If you look at all of the kind of investment in many different ways, including new assets from airlines all over the world, and what you find is that US carriers are actually putting quite a bit of capacity, and not just the old aircraft from like 6 years ago. They're actually fundamentally investing in markets. I would say West Africa and Southern Africa are the best way to look at that, where you had national carriers struggling, like South African Airways going through South Africa's version of Chapter 11 business rescue. United, Delta really stepped up in terms of capacity, and that's not for charity, that's because of the market. Around policy, I do think that again, that is where we are African in our ways. I think it's very interesting. A lot of my clients are several AU member countries and different agencies. And it's interesting. I think that policy is absolutely a mechanism that can be used for commercial reasons and is being used. But I also do think that we sit in a space where there's a lot of cooperation, an extreme amount of cooperation and collaboration. I'm really blessed to be in rooms where I see that at the highest levels to tactical levels with airlines. You see that all the time. But I also think there's a lot of unnecessary competition. If I have a new client that says, "Oh, I'd like to start an airline," that's a big red flag for me, because I'm like, why? Why would you like to do so? Because I don't like putting my name on things that don't work. But saying that to say that I think that we need to be very honest in our approach, and I think that affects our competitive offering, because for the 54 countries we have, we cannot all be aviation hubs. That is not commercially sensible. That is not economically viable. Although it might be politically favored, it just doesn't make sense. So I think there's there is a commercial element to how we engage in aviation that I think needs to be stepped up across the board. But I do think that we are quite competitive as an offering, but we have so much underserved demand, and then we have excess supply in markets that we don't necessarily need. So yeah, I think it's a mixed bag, definitely not monolithic, but just looking at how we've improved as a continent over just the last 3-4 years, I do think that we've made significant improvements. And there's more of an understanding. COVID was interesting because COVID forced some sort of rationality in the African aviation market, and I think that is bearing fruit.
Absolutely, absolutely. And even speaking on competitiveness, in your airline career, you've led network planning and alliances. What does it take for African airlines to become more competitive regionally and globally?
Thanks for that question. I think let me take a step back and just explain network planning. So the core business of an airline is, to put people on planes and goods on planes and move around the world, right? So if you ever want to know an airline strategy, doesn't matter what the CEO or the board says, look at that map that you see on the airline's website, or when you're booking, or when you're in the plane that shows where they fly. That actually is their strategy. So my job as a network planner, and the network planning function in any airline is actually profitability. So you design, optimize, and manage the route network. Decide on the fleet, which type of aircraft you will use and how you will deploy them, what does economics look like, and then ultimately how that leads to profitability. So network planning is kind of a heart center of any airline business. And to your question, I think it's quite different. So I like to make an example of Qatar Airways because I do think that a lot of countries are doing this more and more, but Qatar had a very interesting and still has a very interesting strategy where, it's not the Qatar of today. Okay, when I was there, and I'm, fairly young, when I was there, it was not the sexiest place to be in. Dubai was the thing. But Qatar was very clear that we know that we are a small country. We have, we're a high income small country. We have a strategic plan at a national level to be a global force to be reckoned with. And the airline was part and parcel to that. In the same way, 20 years ago, Emirates did the same, and we own the Emirates. And fun fact, Emirates actually went to South African Airways back then to learn about aviation when they were growing. So it's really important to see what happens when a government understands the role of aviation in their economy and then put resources to that. I'm a big fan of this approach called the whole of state of aviation approach, which will, also answer your question directly in terms of competitiveness. So my first my first response is, I think airlines that are successful are honest. They know what they are good at and they know what they are not good at. So ambition is great, but ambition without context is wasted effort. So airlines that are really good, they know who they are, they know what their assets are, they know what strategic leverage they bring to the market, to partners, and what they are not good at. Because a good airline will also do their best to reinforce and mitigate and reinforce those weaker spots and buffer them. So maybe make an example from South African Airways in this regard. One thing I like to credit them for is that I know what it's like to plan with limited and challenged resources, in the sense that your profitability, government is saying we're not going to give them money, the banks are saying we're done with you, your only value is that you've got a sovereign guarantee. But one had to be quite creative, and at the time they say they had 55 aircraft, now they have 18, and a very large network, and with an airline of maturity. I've also, unfortunately closed down certain airlines or been brought in as a board advisor to close down certain airlines, and I always look at the diagnostic and what was the root cause. And I think a lot of it boils down to matching ambition with reality, knowing what you can do and what you can't do. If you are a country that is, geographically challenged and you don't have the resources to generate scale, you cannot be a hub, right? You might have to develop a proposition that is partner friendly. So a plug and play proposition. So airlines that are really successful, they know what they bring to the market, they know what they bring to partners, and they also know what they're not good at. And they then try and mitigate, they try and use the various mechanisms available to mitigate that risk as well. Yeah.
Basically, it lies in identity.
Absolutely.
You know, self-introspection, but obviously with companies knowing what they're good at, that's what analysis. So I hope we're all taking notes. So our next question is, how can African governments cooperate more effectively on aviation policy to reduce fragmentation and unlock intra-African travel?
If any of my clients in the room and listening, I apologize in advance, or anyone who represents different governments. But look, that's my daily, part of my daily work, working with different governments across the continent, Caribbean, US government as well. And I will repeat my same response. Stay in your lane. And I mean that respectfully. But, I will not name certain country, but really, really small country, right? And, on the, we just kind of start to engage, but it's like, what are the goals? And you look at all the strategic documents. And when I hear the word hub, I get like the hairs on my neck stand up because I just see it all the time. And it's like you cannot be a hub. Like there's no the propensity to travel. The dynamics are just not there. I'm not saying that one can't strategically invest and make a place a hub. Emirates was not a hub before. Doha was not a hub before. Addis was not a hub before, and the government strategically invested. But you really have to be clear about not just what you want, but what does your country want, and what are you, and how does everything work well together? The reason why Ethiopia, Qatar, UAE are successful, in my view, even Turkey around aviation and the contribution is not because they've got airlines that are invested in that have a great commercial model. Yes, that's true, but they also have a whole of state of government approach to aviation, which means that every piece economically understand that there's a strategic sector. The same way we talk critical minerals, the same way we talk energy. If there is an understanding and a strategic intent from a government that says we are following a whole of state of aviation approach, everything works well together. And not just in elements like we think of a Department of Tourism, visa issuances, etc., but across the synergies that happen economically within the aviation sector and enabled by the aviation sector, be that manufacturing, be that services, be that certain skills, be that STEM, be that MRO, education. I think particularly the Gulf carriers are a really good example of what that whole state of aviation approach looks like. And governments that are successful in aviation, irrespective of where they are, they tend to follow that approach, even if they might not have a national carrier, for example. So I think what I advise clients on a daily, also noting that clients have different requirements, different goals, different political cycles, is that it's great to want this for the sector, but what is the readiness for a whole of state of aviation approach? And what are you truly trying to achieve? There's some countries that will invest in aviation. I think Mauritius is an excellent example. Large island nation, aviation is critical, to the country's functioning, but they also want to be known as a premium tourism destination. So all of the efforts around that, involving in Mauritius, involving the government's approach, involving what we call the BASA, the Bilateral Air Service Agreement, which is basically the negotiated agreement between two countries and how the airline sectors work together, how many airlines can fly, how many routes, which aircraft. That all kind of boils into this approach because they understand what they're trying to achieve. And then there's some countries that I think are just, it's a bit confusing, I'll be frank. Particularly in East Africa, I won't mention which countries, but there's national carriers, there's investment, there's all these great things, but you are located very closely to Kenya and Ethiopia. Like, how competitive are you actually going to be by investing in this national carrier and saying that you want to be a hub? We're not going to have 4 hubs in East Africa, it's just not going to work. So I think that there is and this is where I get a bit firm in my advisory, particularly government clients, but you really need to be honest about your responsibility to your citizenry and to your economy, because it doesn't take a lot to make money in aviation in terms of revenue, but it is that much quicker to add costs and make a loss. And I've seen airlines that you never think really have to do the most according to whatever the jurisdiction allows to save the entity. And unfortunately, in that case, like Namibia, unfortunately, in Namibia, unfortunately, collapsed in 2019. I was brought in as a board advisor to support that process. It was very painful because Namibia does not have, for example, Chapter 11, that process, or South African Business Rescue. A creditor can effectively move them into liquidation. And Namibia had a fiscal hold that was, in my opinion, not that much. I obviously won't give you a mark, but really not a huge amount. And not only was the airline liquidated, but all of that skill, all of that capacity was gone. And yes, there's a notion that of course private sector has a gap, but has a role, but private sector also has an incentive. And Namibia, which is a large landmass country, different levels of fragmentation, the private carriers, even for an open market, had no incentive to be flying and building unprofitable routes from the north to the south of the country. They want to put capacity into Windhoek and fly elsewhere. And what one saw 2-3 years, flying within Namibia became so expensive that to this day, it's still a struggle. So that's where I believe that one can't really separate the role of private and public sector in aviation, because transport is a public good and it actually gives citizens access. It gives economic access. One should not be better off being in a large city versus a smaller town simply because of access. So I think that's what aviation tries to resolve. But it does mean that you have to be really honest about your goals as a government, and that is a very kind of bottom-up approach versus top-down ambition.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then also speaking of, the access or economic growth, what about the African continental free trade area? How do you think they could help accelerate aviation growth together with the single African air transport market? So what's your take on that?
Yeah. So a bit of background, SATM, the Single African Air Transport Market, which kind of had its hype in 2018, is really it is a reframing and kind of a final push for momentum from the Yamoussoukro Declaration and Decision, which is, already 70s, 80s, when the AU wasn't even formed as yet, its predecessor was there. So I say this in criticism to several governments because I think they talk more than they act. But I also say, just from that perspective, that SATM from 2018, there was a solemn commitment. Many African countries signed up and said, we're going to do this liberalized African skies. And the point of YD and the point of SATM was to have open skies agreements. And there's different mechanisms to that, allowing for African aviation to really support intra-African travel. Because as it stands, intra-Africa travel accounts for less than a quarter of all travel within Africa, right? We are a largely international market. Different countries have different proportions, but we are, we travel least amongst ourselves. And I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. There's economic reasons, there's economic incentives by certain countries, and there's a whole host of other things. But that was a point of SATM. And as part of AFCTA, one of the tenets of AFCTA is that our people should be able to move freely, so visa access, and they should be able to travel accordingly. So SATM is actually not just in itself a business imperative, but it is also an enabler for AFCTA. Just recently, the African AFCAC, the African Civil Aviation Authority, so they're like the FAA for the continent, they're an AU body. They recently said, because of an assembly this week in Montreal, they basically said that, the low-hanging fruit of SATM and AFCTA is 80 billion in the continent. So there's been a lot of advocacy and policy work around that. And I really credit my colleagues, not just in the multilaterals, in the individual airlines, in the different governments, the different ministries of transport, etc. There's been a significant amount of work that's been done. But I also think it gets a little bit heavy because one of the, as a former airline executive myself, especially working for national carriers, one of the interesting parts about Saturn was that it actually created a conflict between a national airline and their own shareholder government, right? So I think that what the failings of Saturn have been is that they fail to understand the context of airlines. Even airlines that are highly politicized, they still have some sort of commercial basis. And a lot of those decisions, even the government shareholder might not have the capacity or the interest in understanding. So I think that a true policy that represents aviation absolutely has to take into account airlines themselves. And I think that that's where Saturn has failed in many ways, but I think that the advocacy work has supported that. Saying that to say that it's also been helpful, the continent's really rallied around security and safety. I mean, just 2023 to 2024, we had a safety rating of around, it's like 59%, and last year 61%, and the global average is up to 70 for people, roll their eyes. Yeah. And then on specific aspects, those numbers increased as well. So I think that Saturn is important, Saturn is great, but I think countries have struggled, and not just at a country level, at a sector level, and different incentives for different parties. Airports and airlines have two very different incentives, even if they're owned by the same shareholder. So that coordination piece is important. I think one thing that's critical is working, leveraging the role of regional economic communities. So, the ECOWAS, SADC, East African Community, those are really powerful and really, they move a lot quicker than, these large continental objectives. I do advise countries really double down their efforts in any regional economic community that they're in, because there's so much more, I feel, ability to have traction and move with certain mechanisms and lobby for certain things. And generally, there's a context that's understood that might, remove some of the tensions at a continental level. So I do think that people need to leverage their regional economic communities for Saturn to work. Saturn is full of many different pieces, but the goal is we want to enable Africans to fly and trade within Africa, and we should ask ourselves as African citizens, why are we comfortable with the other part? And I like to leave the least diplomatic for the end when I answer, but at the end of the day, there's no political will. I have sat across enough governments, airline CEOs of certain countries, board members, agencies, presidents' offices, where no one's going to say we don't want to work with our own, we don't want to, of course we want to liberalize, of course we want to, but there really isn't political will. And in many countries, the airline is hanging by a thread of the budget, has like awful governance, no accountability, and that is why that's a certain government wouldn't want to liberalize. So at the end of the day, the reason why Saturn hasn't had traction is because fundamentally there isn't political will. But again, we might open the door for certain letters in the BRICS acronym, but we don't want to open doors for ourselves. So I think that's just a question of what is behind that lack of political will.
Exactly. Because I was, doing my research and I saw how, traveling within Africa, it's quite it's not the same when you compare it with international visits. So as we go on to the third segment, which is aviation as a driver of development, beyond tourism, how can aviation serve as a catalyst for trade, investment, and broader economic development?
Love that question. I'm also going to shout out to my fellow co-author in the room, Lee Simmons. I think in February or so, we wrote an op-ed that was published on DevX, which really looked at aviation in Africa and its role from a development lens. I know with my World Bank hat on, but not on the World Bank for disclaimer. I think that's really the beautiful part about aviation. So not only is it a large business in itself that is made up of many subsectors, as I mentioned, airlines, airports, maintenance and repair, technology firms, OEMs like your Boeing, your Airbus, etc. But it is also an enabler for other things as well. Whether you talk to food security, whether you talk to cargo, whether you talk to poverty alleviation in certain markets. There are just so many different ways that aviation supports development, and I probably want to touch on one aspect that even the US is doing, and EU is doing. Africa does, but not in the formalized way. So I'll talk to public service obligations, PSOs. PSOs basically refer to a program from a government, either national, regional, state level, where because point A to point B is critical for our economy, but it actually doesn't make sense to fly between those 2 points, right? Depending on the country, it could be a smaller island within an island nation. It could be a very rural area. It could be an area that has a different type of weather, for example, like Alaska. It could be in a different context. And PSOs are really critical because PSOs are firstly, they are a form of public-private partnership. They are a very structured incentive program for airlines to provide that essential air service, but they do have some sort of subsidy and support from the government. And when PSOs are set up, not only is it mutually beneficial for the public good aspect as well as the operator that's operating it, they also have certain service level agreements. So there's a minimum number of connectivity you have to have. The airline can't just cancel. There's a whole way that actually ensures that these areas, whether they are rural, urban, anything in between, are connected, but it also has a commercial incentive as well for those operators. The US has had the Essential Air Services Act for decades, and this is in effect in many, many areas. And at state level, there are also different parts of this as well. I think Hawaii is a really fantastic example. Hawaii has an inter-island or neighboring island program where the airline has, at a government level, has support from government around connecting these neighboring islands. And when the Hawaiian-Alaska merger was going through its approval process in the last year, one of those critical factors was that the essential air services needs to remain because a lot of the community that are in these smaller islands, they need to be connected to the mainland. They need to be connected to everywhere else, but it is not fully commercially viable. The airline even, if you have your local ID and you're from there, you even get a free bag, for example, right? So those are certain things that actually bring the public good element as well as the commercial needs together to provide essential air services. In the Caribbean, there's kind of implementation of this, in some ways not as structured. Trinidad and Tobago is a great example. I don't know if anyone's been to Trinidad and Tobago and taken the ferry between the two islands, or the flight from Caribbean Airlines between the two islands. That also represents a PSO, right? That is a fixed price. Caribbean Airlines flies every hour between Trinidad and Tobago. It's a fixed price. Every year, maybe every few years, the government will increase the price. Same as the ferry, it's a fixed price. And again, as much as it's great doing the tourism thing, if you live in Trinidad and Tobago and you are conducting business, seeing your family connected to your community, it should not be a cost barrier to move within your own country. And then I think what happens is, in many jurisdictions, in many countries, and many entities, people say they're PSOs, but they're not really PSOs. It's just more subsidies because the structure of a PSO, that it is public, it can be bidden for, even if there's only one party that can take it up. And there's more of a transparency than just throwing money to subsidize a failing entity. So I think that PSOs represent a good example of why aviation is good for development, because it allows for economic connection, right? And that is not just a moving goods, that is professionals are able to move and trade their services. You are able to generate entire value chains of support. I maybe want to make a example. Boeing is actually one of the, if not the largest exporter of American-made equipment, right? Boeing is a critical entity to global supply chains, and it's not just the planes. These supply chains are across 50, different countries. The government of Angola, for their national airline TAG, they just made an order that was approved, I think, in June for 787-10 aircraft and spare parts from General Electric. This was supported by US Exim Bank. The deal value was like $270 million. Did you know that that deal made by the Angolan government supports 1,400 American jobs? So, the role of aviation for development isn't just within a country, it has global connections as well. And those jobs are specifically in South Carolina and Ohio. So this is a global supply chain where there are willing buyers and sellers across the board. And aviation not only stimulates economic activity in so many ways, it also forms part of your infrastructure proposition. So what you find a lot of the time with World Bank, AFDB, European Investment Bank, when people talk about aviation, there's an element of, this is critical air service. And I think in some markets it's more visible than others. I think Ethiopia is a great example as well, because if you look at how Ethiopia has not just used aviation and developed aviation as a competitive advantage, but there's also now a massive skills capacity within the country and across different parts of the sector as well, be it maintenance and repair, be it a commercial excellence. Countries become centers of excellence and knowledge bases around the skills that they're good at. When you think Germans, we think German cars and German technology. That is absolutely the case in terms of the skills that aviation provides, and there's so many different ways as well.
Yeah, because you did touch on it, which was the next question, but maybe you could elaborate more on this. The roles that global partnerships and the African diaspora can play in shaping Africa's aviation and connectivity story. So just elaborate more on that.
I think so. Partnerships and diaspora. I think partnerships is interesting because aviation is probably the most regulated industry, and it is probably the industry where international standards mirror domestic standards. I don't know of any other sector that has that. Perhaps maybe for avoiding things like nuclear, blasts and stuff like that. But really, aviation has always been a technology first, globally regulated, locally adjusted industry. As we speak right now, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a UN body, the world's FAA, for lack of better words, sitting in Montreal right now, having their assembly where all the governments discuss how we're going to plan and regulate the sector. So what you find that the FAA does looks pretty much similar to many other countries, just at different levels of intensity. Of course, they are, sovereignty is first, but from the industry, even local rules and regulations pull from a globally regulated industry. And just logically speaking, countries are connected to each other, so that's always been the case. So when it comes to multilateralism, when it comes to international collaboration, when it comes to partnerships, aviation has been doing that since time. So I think that becomes even more important. I heard a term recently which I agree with, because we also know that in this world of interesting geopolitics and challenges on the multilateral system, that doesn't mean the need is taken away. Like I'm very much like, I don't care about action. I look at what is left afterwards, and I say that with respect, because it doesn't take away the need. We heard in our previous panel that a lot of these programs are actually just going to different agencies, right, in terms of money and allocation. And I really want to emphasize that the world is not going to stop moving. the world is getting younger, the world population is growing, and where is that growth happening? In the African continent, right? So whatever is happening with people in these positions of power doesn't fundamentally change us as humans. We are never going to sit in our own environment. The human story is one of migration, and transport supports that. So saying that to say that I think global partnerships are going to be even more important, but you're really going to need to know who your allies are. Working with clients in the last 6 months has been really interesting. And I'm a fan of disruption, so I always see an opportunity in drama. But I definitely think that, governments are having some frank conversations where they're saying, oh, damn, like I actually can't do X, Y, Z. What can I do? What am I good at? And I think that's good. Like you need to know what you bring to the table, whether you're an airline or a government in a partnership. And one thing about this dynamic that we're currently experiencing is that there's clarity around what is valued. Transaction value, deal value, supporting economies. That is what is valuable and brought to the table. So I also see what Angola did as strategic, because instead of fluff, they brought a mutually beneficial transaction. So I think that role becomes even more important. The term I was referring to earlier, I lost my train of thought, was that of from multilateralism to minilateralism, where you work with, instead of all these global partners, this environment is showing that you know who your friends are, you have allies in different pockets that you didn't expect, but you have to be very clear about who are your allies, who are your partners, and what is the future goal. And there's just no time for fluff in that regard, because it is such a contentious environment where a lot of what we know as the international order is being challenged, and part of me doesn't necessarily have an issue with that, but it also brings an opportunity for countries to speak to other countries, for parties to speak to other parties. And I think that is really, really good. I personally expect more regional collaboration. I'm very fascinated to see how CARICOM, how Africa work better together, how we really are clear and crisp in our proposition for different countries and for the world. So I don't see the role of global partnerships being diluted. What I do see is an increase in the nuance of those relationships. And some countries just can't afford to be everything to everyone. They need to double down on what they're really good at. And then I think that brings me to your next point on the diaspora. We represent the drivers of demand in this room. When an airline is planning a new route, they look at many factors, and part of that is, yes, of course, there's an element of I can stimulate the market, but they look at what drives demand between 2 points, right? And the power, the economic power of the diaspora economy, I feel is so underplayed. United and Delta flying to West Africa, replacing those aircraft with the old aircraft to new aircraft, making so much money on certain markets, not just in December for dirty December, but throughout the year. That is because of the diaspora dollar. So even just this week, Delta has announced a huge retrofit of its cabins, investing millions in improving their product because they've been getting competition from the Middle Eastern carriers for years. And that's not because people are flying more between DC and New York, no offense. It's because these are global competitors trying to compete globally. So I really do want to emphasize the role of the people in this room representing the diaspora economy. We are the drivers of demand. So we are not just users of the aviation product, we're also enablers of what the sector is doing. Airlines are literally spending millions to understand your data points. They're trying to understand, okay, what makes someone who lives in the US who has African origin go to Nigeria versus going to Ghana? When do they fly? What are their search options? What price are they willing to pay? What do they believe? Like, there is so much investment around understanding us, and I think that's something that, and not just as a market, but as enablers for business. So, aviation demand and connectivity are mutually reinforcing concepts, right? And we are part of that as well. Part of Africa's connectivity in the aviation market is not only supported by users in the diaspora economy, but is enabled by us, because the more we travel, the more trade happens, the more trading of services and ideas and exchange of culture. So those things are absolutely critical to the aviation game. So I just want to also emphasize that as we, have things such as AFCTA, as we have platforms such as, the US Caribbean Forum that was held last week, as we have more and more of these mechanisms that bring our communities together, also understand that your role is not just a user of the economic opportunity or being seen as a market, you're actually an enabler for many other industries as well. And I think that's something that's quite important, particularly to the aviation piece. So I expect to see more. Of that. You're hearing Nigeria talking about, trying to find direct flights to Brazil. You're hearing about, Nigerian airlines investing in, APs, for example, invested in Fiat. Fiat was a multi-jurisdictionally owned Caribbean airline that closed in the last year. They had business restructure. The government of Antigua actually changed its laws to allow for a Chapter 11 type of approach. And, the major shareholder now is a Nigerian airline. A piece now based in Antigua with that subsidiary. So a lot of these investments are happening. I just would like to emphasize and highlight that we are not just a user market, we are actually driving industries in many jurisdictions.
Exactly, we're not just consumers.
Absolutely.
We are the change makers,
Absolutely.
as you can say. So we are now in the Q&A session. I'm seeing a few hands. So could you just raise your hands for the question? Okay.
Good afternoon. Interesting panel. Ogaga, you're on point with Ladies. You're the expert. I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who are thinking, okay, yes, aviation is going well. How come Africa, we're still seeing this lack of travel between countries in the same continent, in the same region? In some effects, in some instances, you have to go to Europe and come back. Vis-a-vis compared to like the corridor in Southeast Asia or Latin America. That's one question. Second question is, you worked for SA Airlines and then I think Emirates, right? Emirates? Qatar. I'm sorry. People just don't realize what it takes to not only maintain the plane, keep up the standard. How important are maintenance, repair, and overhaul facilities for the African continent? So if you answer those two questions. MRO.
Repeat the first one.
The first one is basically, there's all the, a lot of people are saying, hey, for me to get from West Africa to East Africa, I gotta go through Europe. Talk about those pain points. So talk about why that is the case, because it's not as easy to answer that question, even in the era of after. The second question was about what it takes to maintain not only the planes, facilities, that sort of things, and then we talk more. We'll actually explain what an MRO is for people that don't know.
Are we gonna take other questions or
you can answer that one and then the next question.
Okay, so again, shouting out to our article that we wrote earlier this year, but there are a couple of challenges to why traveling in Africa is such a mission. And I'll start with more so the structural factors, right? So just with the cost environment, aviation is a global industry. So a lot of the costs are, priced in a global market, right? And saying that to say that we've been so lucky in the last year because jet fuel is so competitive that the industry is actually benefiting a lot from that. But it's a high cost industry in that regard. So first you have your aircraft global market. Right now, there's a 17,000 aircraft backlog in the global supply chain. African airlines are not necessarily going to be the front of that, the bargaining chip, right? We just don't have the economies. Maybe for a handful of countries, but we just don't have that. A Southwest has more aircraft than multiple African airlines combined. So there's a numbers game, and that really impacts things. If you don't have economies, you will be struggling. And then there's of course the currency effect as well. And then we do what we do on ourselves. We call it TFC, so taxes, fees, and charges. There are taxes levied on different parts of the industry, very different in many countries. There's a significant amount of work in Africa and in the Caribbean countries where they are really working regionally to try and rationalize TFCs, taxes, fees, and charges, because they are simply stopping us from intra-African travel. What you'll find in many, many examples is that some of the taxes, fees, and charges are far less if it is a extra regional flight, so like the continent to another continent and vice versa, versus a country an hour away from another country in Africa. It's work that I've been doing probably since day one in my career and still working on it now. I think that's just a political element. I also think that governments, quite frankly, are a bit lazy in some of their revenue generating efforts. So, sovereignty, I'm a fan of sovereignty, absolutely, and generate the revenue that you need to as a government. But if you are going to see a short-term win in levying a random tax and a fee and a charge, what does that mean in terms of dissuading demand? That has huge impacts beyond that short limit. There's a country in East Africa that has just announced, Tanzania, that has just announced a $90 tourist facilitation fee. And in another capacity, I did have an engagement with them the week that it came out. Something came out last week, and I had a meeting with some government officials that Thursday, and I said, hey, how did this come about? And they were like, look, we actually needed to fund infrastructure, which is actually in the public-facing statement. And I think that when that works, it does work well, because taxes, fees, and charges should actually fund infrastructure and fund the industry. But I'll be honest, a lot of the times that simply does not happen. The collector agency doesn't pass it on to the entity that's required. It does not work more often than it does work. It is literally just to generate revenues. And that also has been used as a mechanism for countries that are very open. Right? West Africa technically is actually very open. ECOWAS is a very open market, especially for ECOWAS airlines, right? It's not for lack of liberalized skies, but a lot of governments have insane taxes, fees, and charges. There's some crazy things I've seen simply to add another barrier to protect a certain carrier. So there's a very strong role that TSCs play, and African governments, with due respect, are just not using it strategically. On the MRO side, to maintaining planes, there's a whole other industry and a whole other capacity. Beg your pardon?
What is MRO?
Oh, sorry, MRO. So MRO stands for Maintenance and Repair Organization, and that talks to the technical maintenance of an airline, right? And a specific aircraft. Now, every airline needs to have their own facilities in some shape or form. So you have different intensities of maintenance, of MRO repairs. We have light checks, or weekly checks, daily checks. Those are called A checks, just at a simple level. And then you have something heavier like a D check. So a lot of airlines, especially in Africa, have developed capacities across different levels of intensity. These are aircraft engineers. These are people specialize in the airframe. These are people specialize in technology. And with AI has always been part of the aviation game. When your price changes and you're booking a ticket, that has always been AI predictive modeling, right? So these terms have just been part and parcel of the industry, but I digress. So MRO is huge, because if you look at a country like Ethiopia with over 150 aircraft, that skill, which many years ago may have been outsourced, is insourced in a country where people have the skills. Ethiopian have their own MRO organization, and many large carriers have their own MRO organization. And the goal for many of these large airlines that are trying to diversify is to be able to do the heavier checks within their organization. Because guess what? If I'm Ethiopian MRO, I can actually do services for other airlines, for Kenya, for Morocco, etc. So these are really important things that happen in the industry. And in terms of maintenance, it's not just the maintenance piece in terms of the physical maintenance, but there's also the cost piece. And just briefly on this, when airlines are acquiring aircraft, very rarely do you just buy an asset. Even airlines that can afford it, like Emirates and Qatar, it just doesn't make financial sense. There's a whole world of leasing as a route to acquisition, and it depends on all of your different requirements from a corporate finance side. But saying that to say that when you are purchasing an aircraft, you have what we call PDPs, pre-delivery payments. So 12 months before an aircraft comes into an airline, you have paid probably about 10% of that asset, right? So these are highly it's high capital intensive assets. It requires infrastructure, not just on the physical side, on the skill side, on the financial side. So aviation is really a capital intensive business, and different countries have got different levels of development around that. So I just wanted to put that piece as well. And that's a whole different skill set. It's a whole different advantage that airlines can have because they can actually service other parts of the industry. And this is where you have synergy with space infrastructure, with defense infrastructure. A lot of these skills and capacities have been designed synergistically. I take it back to South Africa. The government is even trying to push our defense company Denel to work better with SA Technical because some of those skills are so complementary, and even the infrastructure that is there is co-located. So that's just an important point as well. MROs also support other industries, including space, defense, even agriculture in many ways.
Thank you very, very much. Very illuminating. So my question hitting the word out of my mouth. So my question is related to, could you share insights? Are you seeing that African governments are pushing towards regulation in terms of drones? One. And then secondly, have you had any insights in terms of MROs being established in Africa? Because in West Africa, because we've noticed that I thought that part of the high cost of tickets for regional and in domestic flights has to do with aviation fuel and the fact that they have to fly the planes elsewhere in Europe or wherever to do maintenance and servicing. So if MROs are so important in terms of general maintenance of the airline and the airports and also job creation and everything, how come we don't have one maybe in West Africa?
Yeah, it's almost like a chicken and an egg one. So MROs also follow. It's almost like airlines have to take the hit in investment, stimulate markets, generate this economy, and then everything else flows. Because I've had clients who are MROs and trying to develop new markets or into new markets or whatever. And it's interesting because MROs have to go where there's some sort of critical mass, strategic benefit, or there's a very positive, a very large and positive signal that there's going to be that in the near future. You'll find that ATR, for example, ATR is one of the, we have like 5 aircraft manufacturers globally. We all know Boeing, we all know Airbus, we have Bombardier, we have ATR, we have Comac in China, so we have very, very few. So when these MROs now set up infrastructure, they are either going to co-locate themselves to a very large client, or they're going to put themselves in a jurisdiction which allows where there is future investment for that capability. So West Africa is interesting. Nigeria, very expensive to travel domestically. Good number of airlines, but inconsistency in service offering, no national carrier. And interestingly, with jet fuel, most of the jet fuel in African countries is actually imported. We don't have our own refineries. Thank God for the the Dangote refinery that's coming online. But like, we should be producing our own jet fuel. That's a whole other thing. A big part of our work is sustainable aviation fuel, but topic for another day. So saying that to say that in West Africa has been interesting because what you'll find is that certain national carriers, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, in particular, when they are purchasing aircraft orders, you will often find that the OEM, be they Airbus or Boeing, but a lot of the times Airbus in this context, would be setting up MRO facilities of different scale and capability. So that's a very interesting one. There always has to be like an anchor client or an anchor market. And that's why a lot of these OEMs will kind of push for orders that are fairly large, or they'll push for an order of 20 and options of 50, because that creates that kind of investment incentive for these capabilities. And MROs are very complex. It's a lot of physical infrastructure, it's a lot of people infrastructure, it's a lot of skill. There was an airline, South African Airways, which is now out of business rescue. My client was a private equity firm that developed a consortium to purchase 51% of them on sale from the government. And part of my scope was to the strategy that SA is fulfilling now, that came from me and my team's pen, where you also had to look at the assets differently in the due diligence. You had to look at SA technical and how it competes, how it doesn't compete. So saying all of that to say that it has to make sense beyond the airline for that investment to occur. And then just on the taxes, like the high cost, that becomes a compounding effect as well. Domestic and regional operations really suffer when there isn't enough aviation supply, because the supply that's there will be favored for international routes where they can make more money. So that doesn't support local and regional travel.
All right.
Sorry, I forgot the drones. Quick one on the drones. I saw the wrap up.
Okay.
Yes, drone regulations are called RPAS, remotely piloted automated system regulation. Very different in different countries and different applications. So it's a yes and a no. There's absolutely been more regulation now than there was 3, 4, 5 years ago. But it also depends on the amount of applications, right? Because different countries are using it for different things. In East Africa, you find a lot of kind of like food security applications for drone technology, right? In certain markets, you have different requirements around licensing for that. So the first port of call is actually the Civil Aviation Authority, because they need to provide these licenses. And what one is seeing is that the different approaches to policy development are really putting a lot of pressure on these CAAs. So that's where ICAO is quite involved. That's where there's a lot of support and guidance. But I've noticed that it's a lot more of a mixed bag than I thought it would be, where before drones kind of really took off and became pervasive, simply because different countries are using them for different things. And then there's a very clear delineation when it comes to anything around defense. So it really is dependent on those local civil aviation authority rules, because they typically provide the licensing at a commercial level, but then there's a whole other discussion for individualized elements, right? A lot of this is just not regulated, especially when it's at an individual level. So the more commercial applications, I think that is what is forcing regulation versus private citizens.
Thank you so much. Because of time, we're not able to get more questions, but I believe that after the session, during the break, you'll be able to ask him as many questions as you'd like. But thank you so much, Ogaga, for your insightful. So in a nutshell, we've heard that aviation is more than an industry. If Africa has the right investment, strategic planning, we'll be able to have a limitless aviation sector.